Today I'm going to walk you through how I calculate warp and weft yarn requirements to make sure that I have enough yarn for my project, or when I'm ordering yarn that I make sure to buy enough. So I have on my website a warp download that will help you keep records, and you can see here how I've used some of it, and it's a free download. And it will take you to this file so you can calculate your yarn that you're going to need, which is what I'm going to walk through today. But it also has a place for your drawdown and things that you can keep track of, the yarn that you used, what your set was, if you wet finish it, how does that change, how does it wear later on, how much it cost you in terms of material cost as well as time that you spent, things that you learn from your project, and if you wanted to keep track of your samples and your labels, there's a space for that as well. If you find this helpful, be sure and drop a like and comment below. It really helps us out. Even better, be sure and subscribe for more great content. I've also put all of the calculations into this Excel document, and this will be available for free on my website as well, so be sure and check that out. I have added some sample length. This is my first big warp on my Cricut Quartet, and so I'm going to be doing a lot of sampling and really getting a sense for how this loom behaves. So I'm going to make a pretty big sample length. I'm going to give it 75 inches. Project length, I'm going to be doing a table runner. I want it to be 72 inches. I've got fringe or hems. I think I'm going to do fringe, and I'm going to give 10 inches on each side of the table runner for fringe. I might not use all of that, but especially when you're twisting fringe, it's nice to have plenty of space. So 10 inches on each side, that's 20 inches. Take up is what happens when the warp yarns actually go over and under the weft yarn. So it actually is not completely flat. And as you weave, you lose just a little bit of length from that cloth becoming dimensional. So the take up is the total weaving length from the adding the sample length and the project length, and it's about 10%. It's impossible to know until you've used a yarn and gotten really familiar with it what the take up is going to be. So the first time I work with this yarn, I'll give it 10%. If it turns out to shrink a lot more or a lot less, then I'll adjust this later on when I weave it with that yarn again. Shrinkage, same idea. The first time that you wash it, it's actually going to shrink a little bit. I've given it 10%, just assuming that that's a good place to start. Again, certain fibers are going to shrink much more and much less. I'm going to be using a linen, which is going to shrink significantly less than, say, a merino wool. So knowing your fibers, knowing how they behave is really important, and that's part of what this sampling is for. So my sample, I can cut it off, and I might not weave that whole 75 inches. I might weave a few inches, say a 12-inch piece, cut it off, wash it, see how I like the results, see what the shrinkage is, and then I can go in and adjust my calculations for how much I actually need to weave later on. Now for stretch, I'm using a linen. It has almost no stretch to it. If I were using a knitting yarn, I would want to factor in stretch because it is going to affect the finished length of the project. Loom waste is also really important. You are always going to have some loom waste. This is the amount that just can't get woven. Sometimes this can get accounted for in your fringe, so that's kind of helpful if you're just weaving one piece, but I'm going to give it 18 inches just to be on the safe side. And that's basically the length that I've observed from working on my Cricut Quartet. Every loom has a different amount of loom waste. A bigger loom might have much more than that. So now I have the total length of my warp in inches, and I've divided that by 36 to get the total length of my warp in yards. Now I am going to decrease the decimal points on that so that it rounds up to 6. So I have a nice even 6-yard warp. So that will make me happy. And then I want to also calculate my finished width. So I have decided that I want that to be 11.8 inches. Draw in is how much your weaving shrinks widthwise as you're actually weaving it on the loom. You're always going to have a little bit of draw in, but you don't want to have too much. So I'm going to give it about a 1/2 inch. That's about appropriate for my Cricut Quartet. Then you are also going to have shrinkage when you wash it. So again, this goes back to your sampling, and I've got a 13.48 inches on the loom. Now remember, the Cricut Quartet is 13.5 inches, so I can't go above that, but any number below that is going to work out just fine. This is skating right at that full width, which is actually what I wanted because I'm trying to get a full sense of how this loom behaves at its maximum capacity. So then you need to calculate your set, and that is based on the yarn that you're working with and the fabric that you want to create. I am using a linen yarn, and I am going to have that at 20 ends per inch. So that tells me I need 269.9 warp ends as a total. I'm going to round that up because I can't have 0.9 ends. And so I have push those up, and so then I'm going to round that up. So now I'm going to multiply my total length in inches times the warp ends that I need for my project, and that tells me I need 57,802.24 inches of yarn for my warp. Now, we don't usually measure in inches because that is pretty overwhelming, so I'm going to divide that by 36 to get the yardage that I need, and I am going to round that. So 1,606 yards for my warp. Next, I'm going to calculate the amount of weft that I need. So the length of one weft shot in inches. Now it would be really easy to take the on loom width and plug that in, but you actually are going to want to allow a little bit more than that. So I'm going to say that if my on loom width is 13.5 and I'm using a pretty thin weft, 14 is a good place to start. My shots per inch, that is the how densely it's woven, and I want a balanced weave, so I want that to be the same number as my set. So I'm going to make that 20. So it needs 280 inches of yarn to weave 1 inch of fabric. Now, some of these other calculations are already done for you. This number of inches to be woven is the sample length plus your project length. So in this instance, it's going to be 147 inches of warp are going to be woven. And that tells me I need 41,000 inches of weft. And then I divide that by 36 to get 1,143 yards of weft yarn needed. The last and most important step is to calculate how much total yardage you need. So you're just going to add together your two numbers for your warp and your weft, and you're going to get 2,750 yards needed for your project. So the yarn that I am using is this 3-ply linen from Weaver House. It is really thin. It's maybe kind of close to an 8-2 cotton yarn, and their suggested EPI is 12 to 18. I'm setting it at 20 because I'm doing a twill, and those tend to do better a little bit closer together. And I have 3,450 yards on a cone, and just to double check, I have 2,750 yards needed for my project. So I'm going to have plenty of yarn for my warp. So that is how I calculate the yardage. Next up, I'm going to be actually entering in my pattern into Weave It, and that will be a whole separate video, so be sure and check that out. Thanks for watching. Be sure and hit subscribe and like if you found this video useful. I really do appreciate it.